Welcome to another episode of Emerging Environments. Today on the podcast, we welcome Dr. Jodi Hilty. Jodi is the president and chief scientist of the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which you'll hear us refer to as Y2Y in our conversation. Jodi is a wildlife corridor ecologist and conservationist with over 20 years of experience managing large-scale conservation programs. She has co-edited or been lead author on 4 books, the most recent of which is titled Corridor Ecology, Linking Landscapes for Biodiversity Conservation and Climate Adaptation, which was published in 2019. She currently serves as deputy chair of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Connectivity Committee. She was born and raised in the Rocky Mountains and has a deep-rooted passion for protecting the species and the ecosystems in the Y2Y region.
With Jodi, we talked about the scope of Y2Y, her contributions to international planning efforts for ecological connectivity, and the nature of interjurisdictional and multi-organizational conservation initiatives. Y2Y is such a great organization to talk about because they have such an expansive vision for conservation and they have so many linkages with all sorts of other organizations in that region. They really are an exemplar of how to think big about conservation and how to use science to spur action and support from the public. So please enjoy our talk with Dr. Jodi Hilty.
Hi, Jodi. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get into our conversation about Y2Y, we'd love to hear a little bit about you and your career path. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you became interested in conservation and kind of a career in conservation.
Well, sure. I think for me, probably conservation started very early. I was born in the Rockies and grew up in the mountains. And I literally spent my childhood riding horses through the mountains looking for things like mountain lion kills. So I think,
wow.
It was probably a pretty early obsession. You know, I went on to graduate school where I got some skills and tools. And in particular, I learned something called GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. And what that tool allows people like me to do is to do sort of spatial planning and analysis to understand maybe where there might be potential conflicts between people and particular populations of animals. And so when I got out of graduate school, it wasn't too long after that I ended up living in Zambia, working on a community-based wildlife management program there. And that was very much about mapping actual real conflicts, working with village scouts to understand what kind of ground they were covering when they were looking for things like poachers and where the distributions of animals were that they were seeing that we were looking to make sure were protected for this program. And that was just amazing. The diversity of life in that country was truly inspiring, and the dedication of these village scouts that were going out to protect what they understood were part of their livelihoods, these wildlife, was just so cool. And so when I came back from Africa, I knew that I wanted to work on these sort of programs that integrated both communities and people into conservation. And I ended up working for a group called the Wildlife Conservation Society, helping them run their Africa program for a few years, and then realized I needed more education. So I went back and got my PhD in landscape ecology. And I specialized in wildlife corridors. How do animals get from one place that they need to be and to another place, such as for migrations or to find food, to find mates. And that's pretty much been my passion ever since.
Wow.
So that's my history in a thumbnail. Yeah.
Cool. Well, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, where you are now, and the importance of wildlife corridors and connectivity in conservation.
Sure. So I originally joined the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative in the early 2000s, actually as a Y2Y board member. And I did because obviously I have wildlife corridor expertise, and the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is sort of like a mega corridor in some ways. It's really a network of protected areas and connectivity areas that are to function as a whole for one of the most intact mountain ecosystems left in North America. I then came back to Y2Y about 5 years ago when they were looking for a new president. And as I was considering whether this was the right job for me, I interviewed a lot of different people about their thoughts about Y2Y. And I think there were a few things that really got me excited and keep me excited about this job. One is the mission is so cool. It's about connecting and protecting this region all the way from Wyoming, all the way to the Arctic in the Yukon, so that both people and nature can thrive. And that really strikes sort of my heart. And it seems to me to be one of the best ways to move forward with conservation. The second was when I was joining the organization, they had just done a 20-year review. What's happened in the 20 years since this audacious vision was created in 1993? And we've just updated it. So we're submitting a paper on 25 years. And I think what is profound to me and answers the question that I sometimes get, great that you have this big vision, but how do you actually, does it really make a difference on the ground? And it does make a difference on the ground. So you can look at lots of different measures that maybe we'll talk a little bit more about today, but having someone keep that vision and really help to focus local efforts on that most important local corridor that actually matters at the Y2Y scale is what drives forward large landscape conservation.
Amazing. So that kind of ties in well with one of the questions that we had for you about sort of success stories. And you talk about kind of this 20-year review, now 25 years. It's amazing. So maybe you can point to some of the success stories in terms of maybe specific species or specific landscapes that you've seen kind of potentially be restored or maintained or conserved as a result of this Y2Y initiative.
Oh, wow. There are so many great stories to tell. I think I'll start us right at the border of Canada and the US, because trans-border work is sometimes really challenging to do. Y2Y has been hosting a collaborative of over 60 different groups in that region.
Wow.
And one might ask sort of why there? Well, because when the researchers were looking at grizzly bears, they did genetic analyses. And what they showed was that what once was a continuous population, and you wouldn't be able to see any specific genetic signals, was literally breaking up at the border into little populations. And for the most part, those populations could be delineated by the human roads and the development along the roads around it. So it's hard for animals like grizzly bears, but lots of other animals, to get across those roads and successfully breed. And so we had a number of isolated populations there. So to make a long story short, a lot of work, a lot of really focused work led to the increase of a number of different wildlife corridors, so protecting land, doing coexistence work, and we also secured some core habitat in the United States. There was a population that was somewhere around 10 individuals. Today, it's about 60 individuals.
Oh, wow.
And that was, they introduced a bear every year, but also those bears were being kept alive, whereas before it was really a challenge for them. And I think the ultimate test has been a scientist, Dr. Michael Proctor, continued to monitor those grizzly bears, and they're actually using some of those corridors that are that have been conserved and are being restored. And those population numbers are going up, and it's just so exciting to see how, when humans put their minds to it, how that shift can happen. I do want to talk about a second example that is also so cool. So I'm going to take you a little bit further north in sort of the eastern portion of British Columbia to a place called Peace River. And the West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations are some of the nations in that area. Those two nations, First Nations, decided to take on the restoration of mountain caribou. And this is really important because south of them, so many of the populations of mountain caribou have been disappearing. The one trans-border population between the US and British Columbia disappeared a few years ago, and for example. And so in their region of Peace River, caribou have been in great decline. So they took it upon themselves to create this vision of restoring the area. So the first thing they did was they realized they needed to keep the last of the caribou, and the caribou populations were really, really small. And they looked around to figure out what was the best way to sort of bolster that population in the short term, recognizing that in the long term, it's really about habitat. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they created these it's called a caribou maternal pen. It's way up in the windiest part of the subalpine. And when the caribou are about to give birth, they put them in this pen, because what was happening, what the science showed, was that the poor caribou calves were basically all getting killed. Mm-hmm. And if we could keep them alive during that really vulnerable period, that they might have a better chance. And so fast forward a number of years later, just even in the last 3 years, there were somewhere around 60 caribou. And today they just came out with a new newsletter last week that says that there's 101 caribou. This is the model, the only success story, really successful story of restoring caribou. But beyond that, as important as just keeping the animals alive is that they now have an agreement with the federal government, BC, and these two First Nations to create the third largest protected area, an Indigenous-led protected area in that region, which will require an enormous amount of restoration and continual work, like a Guardians program with the First Nations, to really keep these caribou alive. So this is a story that is really promising. It's not done yet, but it's just so incredible. And I should say, like, it's a whole community's event. So they would get school children out there collecting lichen for those captive caribou to breed. And these kids are so good at collecting it. They are so fast. My colleague went out there and he was so ashamed when he came back and he barely had any, and these kids had like massive amounts of it. So, it's a really neat thing when communities lean in to care about their cultural heritage and including their wildlife heritage.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. That's a great success story. So thinking a little bit more about Indigenous-led conservation and how Y2Y engages with that and interacts with that, can you speak a little bit about, I guess, the Y2Y initiative and how that engages Indigenous people, and what types of synergies occur in those interactions?
Yeah. I would say it's evolved over time. I think we held our first we tried to bring lots of Indigenous communities together in 2003 for some early discussions of their vision of what Y2Y should be. There are 75 territories of Indigenous peoples crisscrossing the whole Y2Y region, and they are the rights holders of those territories. So in recognizing that, Y2Y has been working and supporting First Nations and other Indigenous peoples to realize their conservation vision. So where we have sort of shared visions, whether it's on caribou or down in the United States, the Nez Perce are working on the Camas to condors corridor, and have asked for some help just in facilitating getting a collaborative together to realize that vision. Or likewise, the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is a transboundary group of people between Alberta and Montana, they have this incredible initiative. It's called the INNI Initiative, IINNII. And in their language, that means bison or buffalo.
Mm.
And so in their culture, as I understand it, bison are sort of the center of their universe. And so they have this amazing vision that's really holistic about bringing bison back to that landscape in a way that heals the landscape, and also heals the people. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we're really privileged to be able to provide some small support here and there as they work to realize that vision. And so I guess I would say that the Y to Y approach is really coming to develop relationship with different Indigenous peoples. Certainly we're a small organization, so we're not across all 75 territories, but where we can, and working with Indigenous peoples on what their vision is, and where there's a great intersection, we can really help to amplify that work or support it in different ways. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they're their own government. And so they have such incredible power to realize that vision. But because of the history of Indigenous peoples in both Canada and the US, sometimes realizing that power has been a struggle. And it's just so exciting. Like, we look at today, in about the last 2 years, about 14 million acres have been put into sort of Indigenous-led, protected and conserved areas through agreements with the federal governments and the territorial or provincial governments and Indigenous peoples. Those are still being sort of realized through the agreement process, but that's just so incredible and so important. And it's because they recognize that nature is part of their heritage and part of their culture and needs to be honored as well as we move forward in society.
Yeah, I think Y2Y, it sounds like you're in an excellent position to, facilitate those relationships and support, those Indigenous-led projects, as you pointed out there. I think it's fantastic. I guess, maybe scaling up from that a little bit, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the multi-organizational or sort of interjurisdictional nature of Y2Y, and what are the main challenges there when you're dealing with, private land ownership in some cases? Is there resistance in some cases to connectivity projects?
Well, sometimes when I'm looking at a map, I just want to take a pencil and just erase all of the boundaries that we can create because, wildlife don't actually recognize them. I think it is so challenging. I just a few weeks ago, we had this wolf that was here in Banff, Wolf 2001, and it was hanging out and it was just getting ready to disperse. And so it did. It took this huge hundreds of kilometers jaunt down to Montana, and where it was, oh my gosh, I just saw a coyote pass my window. Sorry. But anyway, it took this big jaunt from Banff all the way down to Montana, and then it was actually legally killed in Montana. And I think, there's two parts to this story, right? One is, wow, it's so great that this animal still has the potential and still can move such great distances in the Y2Y region. That's a story of hope. The story of challenge is that wolves are more than 6 times more likely to die if they step out of a protected area and to die by human cause. Likewise, grizzly bears, if they step out of protected areas, they are most likely going to die because of a human caused death, right, than any other type of death. And so that means we still have a lot of work to do in terms of that. How do we keep bears and wolves and other critters alive when they're crossing all of these artificial human lines? And I think so much of it has to do with relationship. It's Y2Y and the 450 partners that we work with, establishing relationships with community, conversations about values and limited resources, and developing a deeper understanding of the value of nature. It's also those communities and individuals in this region or visiting this region having a connection with nature and understanding themselves and valuing that and acting on that, whether it's through voting or the way they behave in nature or these other ways. I don't think anyone really wants to knowingly harm some pronghorn antelope or some other animal in the landscape. But sometimes I think we just, as human beings, don't know the impacts of our behaviors. So really, it's about sharing that knowledge and having those conversations and finding that common ground, whether it's with private landowners, whether it's with public lands, and some of the arguments right now that are happening, for example, in Alberta around coal mining, open pit coal mining for metallurgical coal. What is the greater and better good for those lands, not just now, but maybe 7 generations from now? And those are really important conversations for society to have.
Reflecting back on your experience in, I think it was Zambia, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel that the lessons learned in that context are equally as applicable in North America, or are they sort of different beasts in terms of connectivity and stakeholder and organizational interactions?
Oh, I love that question because I've had a lot of discussions about this. I think what happened in North America is the model for conservation really started off on, well, we'll just have some protected areas and we're good. And really community-based conservation in so many ways was so much further ahead in places like Zambia, and where human dependence on nature really was critical just for basic daily sustenance. I so remember sitting down with a couple of villages, and there was an argument that was happening. Well, a discussion maybe, more of an argument. So a couple of families wanted to essentially add a village and put it in a place where there was really good hunting. And the other communities had been following these wildlife, and the village scouts had been following these wildlife. And they realized that right where they were going to put that village was going to be it was going to actually disrupt their wildlife. And so it was a very heated conversation, but they negotiated. They talked about what their reasons were on either side. And then they actually found a solution, and those families agreed to move to a different location that was less important for wildlife. And, that's basically what we're talking about in the Y2Y region as well, in so many different ways. Are we going to develop something here, or are we not going to develop something here? Are we going to do something here, or are we not? And what are the trade-offs that we're making when those decisions are completed?
So maybe I'll shift gears a little bit here and ask some questions related to climate change, because that's kind of my area of expertise. And I'm interested in knowing whether, there's been any clear evidence of climate change in what you're seeing throughout the Y2Y region in terms of species migration or that sort of thing, and how important these kind of wildlife corridors are in terms of climate change adaptation and what we're going to see in the coming decades.
Yeah, climate change. Well, I think what is pretty amazing to me is that our founding members of Y2Y realized in 1993 that Y2Y at its coarsest scale was a solution for climate change adaptation, because what the scientists say is, given that climate change is happening, if we want to help biodiversity, animals and plants, be able to survive this rapidly changing climate, we might need to have bigger protected areas and more of them. We need them to be connected, and having topographic diversity can be really important. And so Y2Y at the coarsest scale really encompasses these things. It also has a few refugia that were identified during past climate change events, like in the McKinsey Mountains, like in the Columbia headwaters. And those are places that scientists like you, Karen, can probably tell us a lot more about why they were refugia and why they're likely to be refugia this time. And so absolutely keeping the landscape connected so that animals have the opportunity not only to move south to north, but also move elevationally up and also to different slopes and aspects in order to find that climate niche that is right for them, offers some opportunity for animals and plants to be able to survive at this time. And so at the courses scale, yeah, absolutely. You also asked, what's happening in the Y2Y region. It's clear that fire regimes are totally changing, right? So, probably the most extreme you can look up in the boreal forests, and we're seeing more frequent fires. We're seeing much bigger fires. And that's, really concerning, not just from a climate adaptation perspective, but those, particularly the peat moss boreal forests, hold so much carbon. And I think one of the things the world doesn't know is that, per square foot, some of those boreal forests have more carbon than any other forest in the world, even the tropical forests. And when those things burn, and they burn really hot, we're losing a significant amount of carbon into the air, which is then increasing the climate change over time. And so part of, what causes those fires is, the roads that are beginning to crisscross that region, that are drying out the edges, allowing, a spark from a car to light those fires. And so to me, it means we need to be increasingly careful and have large enough protected areas that if we do have something like a catastrophic fire, we haven't just lost all of the habitat, but that we actually have the potential for nature to recover. And so climate change is a significant challenge for many, many species, right? We have things like endangered West Slope cutthroat trout. And as the water warms to higher and higher elevations, what we're seeing happen is non-native trout that can interbreed with cutthroat trout moving up, like brook trout and brown trout, and sort of taking over their habitat and sometimes interbreeding with them. And so we've got systems that are really kind of at that verge of flipping because of climate change. And, you look at water projections, or you look at species that are dependent on snow. We don't spend a lot of time probably thinking about as humans, but animals like mountain goats actually need that snow to cool down and also to get away from insects. Caribou use snow as well. So what happens as our glaciers continue to decrease? How are those animals going to make it, right? And these are real questions. So I think climate change actually is one of the major threats in the Y2Y region. I also think that really it's about, human activities and development. So the kinds of things that really stop animals are the developments. So it could be anything from natural resource extraction to development of communities in places that are essential for wildlife. Like I live in Canmore. Canmore is kind of like putting a cork in a bottle of wine, right? The Bow Valley is one of the few east-west corridors. It's a low elevation valley, so it's particularly important in the winter for so many wildlife species. And then there's this community that happens to be basically almost all the way across the valley. So there's very few opportunities for wildlife to get around it and to really effectively use the larger valley and move from one protected area to the other. And so right now, this community of Canmore is debating a wildlife corridor and how wide it needs to be and how much development can happen, really pushing wildlife up on slopes where we know they're less likely to travel. So any kind of development can be problematic. And I think the other piece of it is sort of human intolerance, or humans not knowing how their behavior affects wildlife. So there's sort of two subcategories there. So in terms of intolerance, it's people see a predator and they just shoot it, right? If, in those kinds of cases, what that does is it creates isolated populations. So right now, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, part of the southernmost anchor of the Y2Y region, is really pretty isolated. It's we've been working on, the we is the big we, many groups, on reconnecting grizzly bears from Canada down to that Yellowstone population, and maybe even over to the largest wildlands of Idaho, the central Idaho wildlands area, because the bears in Yellowstone are not as genetically diverse as the more northern bears. And so the problem there is tolerance, right? So people often shoot those grizzly bears, and it's hard to get them across the more humanized landscape. Then there's just people don't know that their activities are impacting wildlife. So I'm reminded of, I just went and hiked Johnson Canyon in Banff with my 13-year-old daughter in the winter. It was wonderful. And right now there's an endangered swift that breeds there, and they're really strict, and it's great to see that about where humans can go, really ensuring that people stay on the trail, that they're not interrupting that breeding of that endangered species. And unfortunately, sometimes people are curious, or they don't follow the rules, or maybe they create user-made trails. So for example, we're doing some recreational research right now, looking at where are all the different trails in 2 study areas in Alberta and in British Columbia. And it turns out there's a lot of trails that nobody knew were there, that people have just created. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it often is, because it might be right through critical habitat for an endangered species, or it might run through a river right where cutthroat trout or bull trout are trying to do their breeding and muddy up that water and affect their success. And so those are the kinds of behaviors that we also really need to think about, be aware of, and be planning for in the conservation community, like the people who are doing the management of those lands.
Yeah, that maybe leads nicely into the idea of the potential negative effects of connectivity, where, obviously there's focal species that can benefit immensely from connected landscapes, but when you have, recreational land users using those landscapes as well, you have these things like the flow of non-native and invasive species facilitated by their movement in some cases. Does Y2Y have sort of direct engagement with the science of those types of potentially negative effects of connectivity, or, is that more of an academic question, I guess?
I've written several books and including chapters on the potential negative effects of connectivity. And it is really important when thinking about where to design a wildlife corridor, for example, to think about those potential negatives. So going back to that cutthroat trout example, I worked with Brad Shepard, who was with the Wildlife Conservation Society in Montana. And part of what we were doing was actually trying to create disconnectivity so that those invasive trout couldn't interbreed with the cutthroat trout. So that would be an example where we're actually not promoting connectivity. There's a lot of academic literature talking about the potentials of invasive species, or talking about predators sitting at the end waiting for their prey to get through. Actually, now there's been several studies saying that there's no evidence of that happening. But, I think it's important to consider those. In most cases, most landscapes that were naturally connected before humans came in are going to do well to be reconnected. I think one of the issues is just managing people, right? So in Canmore, where I'm living, the corridors also have recreational trails, and there, now that there's increased humans using those trails, and they're now using them, for example, later and later into the night, they go out with headlamps. And, what's sort of shocking to see is you'll see on the cameras, you'll see a person running by, and literally 30 seconds later, you'll see the mountain lion right behind the person. It's alarming a little bit. But it's about managing those spaces. And so in some places, you'll see corridors, for example, being accessible one time of the year and being closed off another time of the year. Or we see a lot of what we call lay down fences that facilitate things like elk migrations, so that elk aren't getting caught up in livestock fencing, so that during that migration period, when the livestock are elsewhere, they can just lay the fences down and pretty easily put them back up. at low cost to the ranchers so that they're not constantly repairing their fences, but also it makes it easier for wildlife. So it's about knowing what kinds of issues could be conflicts and then managing for those conflicts.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to, a group like Y2Y having that multi-organizational, decentralized type structure. I don't know, maybe that's the wrong word, but the capacity to engage with multiple organizations at multiple scales, I think you're well positioned, as I said before.
Yeah, I think it is. It's true that we are actually really well positioned. And, I think locally sometimes, sometimes people don't know that we're engaged in projects because we're really supporting local entities to engage, with ranching communities or urban communities. And then also, we not only do we work locally and regionally, but we actually work in a targeted way nationally and internationally, because we know that having those higher level enabling policies actually support the communities to get the work done on the ground that they want to advance.
That leads into my next question, which is about, again, scaling up and thinking about that international level where, so you were the lead author last year on an IUCN, I guess, white paper. What kind of document would you call that?
Yeah, it's an IUCN publication. Yeah.
Okay.
Connectivity guidelines. Yeah.
Yeah. So congrats on that. It's a fantastic synthesis and just amalgamation of all the things that are happening with connectivity at the global scale. So I wanted to ask you, where we have these targets for protected areas internationally and globally, and these metrics, in some cases they're flawed where we're just thinking about the area conserved. I was wondering, thinking on connectivity, are there metrics or measures that are emerging as being reflective of success on the ground in terms of connectivity projects?
Yeah. Oh, this is a topic I could talk about for 3 days. Are you ready?
Let's go.
All right, I'll try and consolidate it a little. So those IUCN connectivity guidelines, first of all, I do have some gray hair now, and that's because shepherding hundreds of people from literally every continent except for Antarctica to provide input and actually agree upon what a conserved ecological corridor looks like is hard work. And I think the really exciting thing is that the world realized that we needed this document and that we needed to come to agreement. So as an analogy, when we go to a protected area, whether it's in Canada or Belize or in Zambia, it satisfies a set of globally agreed upon criteria that the IUCN holds, right? So we know that protected area is a protected area is a protected area. It satisfies a certain set of criteria. And there are different kinds of protected areas, but they're all very clearly defined. And the problem with ecological corridors is that we've never tracked them, even for many places. We aren't tracking them at a national level, let alone a global level. And different people were defining them differently. So some people wanted to define ecological corridors, for example, making the whole Y2Y region a ecological corridor. Well, it's really not. It's really protected areas with connectivity between those protected areas, right? And so what those guidelines do is, for the first time ever, very clearly define what has to be achieved to be a conserved ecological corridor. And that's important both on the ground. It's also important for governments. So we're seeing countries like Bhutan, Tanzania, Costa Rica going forward with actually corridor legislation. And we do want to make sure that it's standardized over time. And in fact, here in Canada, they have a Target 1 connectivity group, and they're sort of talking about how for the first time, we're going to actually do connectivity for animals and plants across Canada. So we want to make sure that that's really standardized and effective. I think to date, when we look at global science, there's been a few reviews that sort of say, somewhere, around 10%, 9 to 11% of all of the protected areas in the world are connected. Well, that's what we call sort of a structural connectivity analysis. What that means is like you have a protected area here and a protected area here, and maybe they both have trees, and there's trees in between. So you assume that it's connected. But does it function? Are people hunting in there? You can't tell what happens under that canopy. So we are working right now with Protected Area Planet's database. They're the people who track protected areas around the world, to develop a database that would also track where the conserved corridors are, because 9 to 11% of our protected areas are connected, which by the way is incredibly low and not good from a conservation perspective. But how many of those areas are going to exist next year, and how many of them are going to be bulldozed over? And we really need to know that in order to prioritize where we're going to focus on connectivity conservation. And that's what those guidelines do, is sort of provide that higher level framework that can be used by any local community, regional community, or nation who's endeavoring to move forward on connectivity.
Fantastic.
So I guess maybe just like a couple of broader questions, and maybe thinking a little about the year that we've had, and so many more people going out and enjoying nature and, experiencing nature maybe for the first time, like really getting out there. Do you have any? Yeah, no, I mean, it's amazing, except if you really want to book that campsite and you just can't get it. But maybe you could talk a little bit about like some advice you have for people who are, just sort of venturing out, and how to interact with the landscape in a way that, respects nature and protects these types of initiatives that are going on.
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, I too tried to book an Alberta campsite. I too tried to book a national parks campsite. And in both cases, on both days, they crashed. Here's how I interpret that. Gosh, it's so great that people want to be in nature. We value nature, and we need more parks. That's the bottom line, right? People should be able to get their families into nature. We know it's good for people's health. We know it's good for nature to have that connection. So we do need more parks. So once people get out in nature, whether it's on a day hike or maybe it's camping, I think there's really some obvious things to think about. One is to just be aware of one's own potential impact on wildlife, and how can we minimize those? Well, we can, minimize our footprint. So that might be, keeping an area clean. Don't leave trash. It might mean not going off trail and following sort of trails that are not designated trails, because those have unintended impacts. And it also, one might think about coexistence. So not only do you not want to leave trash because it's not good for other people, but it's also bad for wildlife, particularly if there's food in that trash. It can cause animals to become sort of more habituated to human food. But if people are in places, for example, where there are grizzly bears, get into a grizzly bear course and understand how to use bear spray. It's a really good way to keep bears safe and to keep yourself safe. So those are a few tips. There's lots more. I think, going and talking to rangers, or going to those ranger educational opportunities with families at campgrounds, there's an opportunity to really learn a lot. And it's so fun. There's also tracking courses, so you can learn, even if you don't see animals, you can see on the ground who's been there and what they've been doing by their poop, by the marks they leave on trees. And it's really, really fun to walk through the forest, looking for those signs and seeing who's there ahead of you.
Is Y2Y engaged in any citizen science projects at all, using the people that are accessing these places increasingly? It seems like an opportunity for, enhanced citizen science.
It is an opportunity, and many of our partner organizations are using citizen science. We right now are engaging with UNBC, the government of Alberta, and the government of BC, actually using what we would call a passive method. So if you might have Strava on your phone or AllTrails or some of these apps, it kind of tells us generically where people are going across the landscape. And it's a new way to monitor how people are using any specific area. And that information can then feed into better management of regions. So it's not necessarily actively using people, but passively using people. I think that citizen science is so important, or even just volunteerism on projects. So down right on the BC-Idaho border, we were doing a restoration, and we had lots and lots and lots of people coming to plant 220,000 trees and to identify these endemic bees. That endemic means the bees that are found nowhere else on the planet except for right there. And getting some of the training, and those can be such enriching opportunities.
Amazing. Y2Y sounds like dream job for young conservationists.
Well, there's lots of good science to get done. So come on out and help us learn more about this system so that we can manage it better.
Well, thanks so much, Jodi. It's been great talking to you. Really interesting conversation.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the opportunity to share and appreciate your questions too.
Thanks, Jodi. It was a pleasure.